One of the final Americans who still carried memories from an earlier world died in the mid-20th century. Before she passed, she tried to explain to her family what life had been like long before the America they knew existed. Inside the Library of Congress sits a cabinet filled with the voices of people who are long gone. These voices were never recorded on tape. They survive as written testimony. Thousands of pages produced during a federal project between 1936 and 1940. Government writers were sent into homes across 24 states with a single instruction: record the stories of elderly Americans before those memories disappeared forever. The effort was known as the Federal Writers Project, a New Deal program that gave work to unemployed journalists, authors, and researchers. Their assignment was simple: document the lives of ordinary people. In total, they produced roughly 2,900 life histories. Afterward, the interviews were archived in the Library of Congress. For decades, they remained largely untouched, sitting quietly in storage for nearly 40 years. I came across them accidentally while researching something entirely different. My focus at the time was 19th century architectural records. I had been examining government buildings and courthouses constructed in the 1870s because many of them appeared strangely out of scale with the populations that supposedly used them. That question kept resurfacing in my research. But while digging through those archives, the buildings stopped being the most interesting part of the story. The people did. Those 2,900 interviews captured something historians rarely preserve: the memories of Americans who had lived through a period before the country transformed into the version recorded in textbooks. Their recollections describe a past that does not align neatly with the narrative most people learn in school. To understand what before the change means, consider the timeline. Someone born in 1855 who lived into their mid-80s would have still been alive around 1940. When federal interviewers knocked on doors during the late 1930s, individuals like that were still present, speaking, remembering, telling stories. As children, they would have lived through the 1860s and 1870s, witnessing an era of dramatic change within a single lifetime. Their grandchildren, born decades later in the 1920s and 1930s, heard those memories directly from them. That generation became the last group to receive first-hand oral accounts of a much older America. Today, almost all of them are gone. Some of these long lives are documented. Mary Kelly, born in Michigan in 1851, lived more than a century and died in 1964. Her life stretched from the years before the Civil War to the age of television. Maggie Barnes, born in North Carolina in the early 1880s to a formerly enslaved mother, reportedly lived until 1998 and reached well over 100 years of age. Cases like these were not rare. Gerontology researchers have verified at least 16 individuals born in the 1850s who lived past 110. Many more reached 100. Hundreds lived into their 90s. This meant that an entire generation existed whose memories bridged two very different historical periods. The government had the opportunity to document these witnesses. It recorded fewer than 3,000. Then the project ended. Funding was cut in 1939. Following congressional hearings, the program was handed off to the states, and the interviews were effectively shelved. For roughly 3 decades, they remained inaccessible to the public, which raises a question: What exactly did those people remember? To explore that, one date becomes difficult to ignore. October 8th, 1871. Every American student learns about the Great Chicago Fire, the story of a wooden city, a legendary cow, and the rebuilding that followed. What is rarely discussed is what happened across the region that same night. In Wisconsin, the town of Peshtigo was consumed by a catastrophic firestorm that destroyed the entire community in roughly an hour. Estimates suggest between 2,000 and 2,500 people died, making it the deadliest wildfire in American history. The blaze scorched more than 1,000,000 acres. Survivors described winds strong enough to knock people down, flames moving faster than anyone could outrun them, and temperatures so extreme that people crossing open areas ignited without direct contact with fire. A priest named Peter Pernin survived by submerging himself in the Peshtigo River and later published an eyewitness account in 1874. His description portrayed something unusual. The fire consumed oxygen so rapidly that victims without burns were discovered dead, as though the air itself had become lethal. The blaze behaved less like a typical forest fire and more like an explosive weather system, generating a vortex of superheated wind. On that same night, fires erupted in Holland and Manistee in Michigan, while Port Huron faced a similar threat. Across vast stretches of the upper Midwest, flames appeared almost simultaneously. Meteorological records confirm that fires broke out across multiple states on that evening. The conventional explanation points to drought conditions, logging debris, and powerful winds. Yet historians have long debated the precise simultaneity of the outbreaks. In 1883, one theory proposed that fragments from Biela's comet may have entered the atmosphere and triggered the fires. Decades later, the idea resurfaced in documentaries and scientific discussions, including investigations by aerospace researchers. Reports from Chicago described blue flames burning in basements, an unusual detail because such coloration suggests chemical combustion rather than ordinary wood fires. No definitive explanation has ever been confirmed. But one fact matters for this story. The elderly Americans interviewed during the 1930s had lived through that night as children. Someone 70 years old in 1938 would have been a toddler in 1871. Someone 80 would have been a teenager old enough to watch the sky glow red and to remember what their parents said about it afterward. Official summaries of the WPA interviews mention pioneer life and survival stories from the Chicago fire. But that description only hints at what those memories might contain. What else did those witnesses describe? What did they say about the night so many places burned at once? And why did the project end before the full set of accounts could be documented? The fires were not the only historical gap. In 1890, the United States conducted what was then the most detailed census ever attempted. For the first time, families completed extensive forms that recorded immigration status, naturalization, language ability, home ownership, and Civil War service. Nearly 63 million Americans were documented. Yet, unlike previous censuses, copies were not stored locally. Earlier records had always been duplicated and preserved in county courthouses and state archives. The 1890 census existed primarily in one location, the basement of the Commerce Department in Washington, D.C. In January of 1921, a fire damaged that basement archive. Roughly a quarter of the records were destroyed immediately, while many others were damaged by smoke and water. Investigators never agreed on the cause. The surviving documents were moved to storage. For 12 years, nothing further happened. Then, in 1932, officials compiled a list of materials scheduled for disposal. The damaged census files were included. The Librarian of Congress reviewed the list and did not designate the census for preservation. Congress approved its destruction in February 1933. The following day, construction began on the National Archives building, a fireproof facility intended to prevent exactly this type of loss. Of the nearly 63 million names originally recorded, only a small fraction remain. Another historical thread involves children. Between the mid-19th century and 1929, approximately 250,000 children were transported by train from major eastern cities to rural communities across the Midwest and West. These relocations were organized by charitable institutions such as the Children's Aid Society. At stops along the routes, local families selected children to adopt or employ. Some found stable homes. Others became farm laborers. Fewer than half of the children were actual orphans. Many came from impoverished immigrant families who lacked the resources to keep them. When these children were placed with new families, they were often encouraged or required to sever connections to their past. Names changed. Backgrounds were poorly documented or lost entirely. Hundreds of thousands of Americans grew up unable to identify where they had come from. Seen individually, each of these events appears explainable, but placed together in sequence, they form a pattern some researchers find difficult to ignore. Fires across multiple states in 1871, a census that documented an entire population, later destroyed. Children relocated in large numbers with identities erased. Grand architectural projects built rapidly for world fairs and then dismantled shortly afterward. By the mid-20th century, the people who remembered that earlier era were disappearing. The WPA interviews preserved a portion of their testimony, about 2,900 accounts from 24 states. Yet thousands of elderly Americans were never interviewed. Their memories were shared only within families and eventually faded. Today, the last generation who heard those stories firsthand is nearing the end of its own lifetime. The written testimonies, however, remain. The Library of Congress still holds those transcripts. They have been publicly accessible for decades. Perhaps someone has already read every one of them. Perhaps not. But the words are still there, recorded by government writers who sat across kitchen tables from Americans whose lives spanned a period of dramatic transformation. Archives have a peculiar quality. Even when people forget, the documents continue to wait. And somewhere within those pages may still exist the memories of witnesses describing a past that no longer fits easily inside the history we think we know.